Last year, while on vacation in the Canaries, I began writing a screenplay about a military coup in a fictionalised Arab country. The coup plotters were a disaffected crown prince linked to a privatised military organisation run by American neoconservatives. The company had won a contract to combat Al-Qaeda-linked forces in the lawless east of the country, but those resources had been redirected to internal repression. The coup took place within the context of mass democracy protests in this country. This was a work of fiction. By January 2011, the Arab Spring had begun initially in the countries of the Maghreb. Now, this was an authentic mass movement which was initially rooted in labour struggles, but very quickly facilitated through civil society, through the internet, through citizen journalism, and through the spectacular role that the new media played in these events. This built in part on the effective role that internet journalism had previously played in challenging official views of the war on terror, particularly in Iraq. The Arab Spring has been since described as a wave of democracy that has also challenged fundamentalism and was initially, if conditionally, supported by the West. Now, the limits of the kind of support which these mass movements could expect from the United States, these movements for democracy and for change, had in a way been laid out by Hillary Clinton as early as January 2010. If one deciphers what Hillary Clinton said, one can actually assume that the wave of democracy would and has been supported by the West against dictators who have lost their support base, and authentically supported, but only so long as the interests of international financial institutions like the G8 and the IMF are not directly challenged. The limits of Western support for the Maghreb democracy movement have since been revealed in Libya, where the Benghazi government still isn't recognised by the West, and where military support has been limited and very contrary, and where the freedom fighters are still denounced as Al-Qaeda linked from time to time. The limits of Western support for the democratic wave have also been exposed in Egypt, where ongoing repression by the ruling military, both of the labour movement and of bloggers, has been broadly supported by the West, even as Mubarak has gone on trial. The kind of austerity programme which is likely to now be imposed on Egypt by the G8 is very much likely to lead to more protests and repression, and this repression is likely to be justified on the pretext of a very real threat posed by Salafist Islamic fundamentalists. Now, when it comes to Syria, Western support for the democratic mass movement has been even more conditional than in Libya, and there are a number of reasons for this. In broad terms, Bashir Assad has been given free rein to bury the Arab Spring, and almost defended in doing this by Western politicians like Tony Blair. There has also been Western complicity in the crackdown on mass protests in Bahrain and also in Yemen, and this appears to be much more overt. For example, Obama and the American government have openly supported a media blackout in Bahrain. And there's still the issue, of course, of the $300 billion in military aid to Yemen under the pretext of the war on terror. This poses the question, just how deeply are Western governments and Western private security contractors involved in all of these developments?
Well, what you find is you've got two very distinct ways of recruiting. Some of the companies do still only recruit from within armed forces by only recruiting people who have been recommended by current members of the PMCs, whereas others, including some very high-profile names, have relied simply on training courses in remote locations where they find that anybody who's willing to do the training course can get themselves to the level that that PMC offers. Then you obviously have the difficulties that you're now trying to train someone in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and you're hoping that you're going to be able to give them a decade's worth of experience, which of course isn't possible. In the old days, like you say, a lot of the PMCs were very much only recruited from ex-army, ex-special forces, ex-tier 1, tier 2 units, whereas now you're finding a lot of it happens to be a lot of the people who either never had any forces training whatsoever, or have basically done as little as basic selection, being in the TA or the reserves, for a short period of time, months in some cases, and then all of a sudden they're being pushed into these units. They won't have the same level of discipline as soldiers who've had years doing the job properly. So that's obviously the main issue with the training. You also have people going in, they may have been in the army, but they may well have not been in these correct branches. If they're going into PMC work, the majority of people of the contractors will of course be shooters. The point of them is to act as escorts and security. That means you need people who can shoot. But increasingly you're seeing people who may well have spent time in the logistics for the army, now all of a sudden being put there in a situation where they could be in life or death struggles with in firefights. The way that people react is obviously going to vary depending on the level of training and the level of people.
Although mercenary armies have historically formed a part of both the British and American covert policy, they were not an embedded part of the nation's total force before the Bush administration placed Cheney, Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz in charge of national security strategy. During the Yemen and Oman conflicts of the 1960s and 70s, British military personnel were transferred to the private sector and were part financed by Aramco, the Arab-American oil company, in what would nowadays be called deniable operations. And in many ways, this is the origin of the kind of involvement which we now see of the British military and British government in the crackdown in Bahrain via Saudi Arabia. British mercenary organisations historically were divided. They were divided between those with links to the Foreign Office and MI6 and those who were totally freelance. And the former, the ones who were linked with MI6, were historically described as being part of the circuit. The circuit has its origins in deniable operations in the Arab Gulf and included David Sterling's Watchguard International, an organisation founded by the initial founder of the SAS, and formed a basis for Sterling's GB-75, which was involved in the intimidation of Harold Wilson's government. By contrast, organisations outside the circuit would have included Colonel Callan's notorious mercenaries in Angola, which were not in any way linked or supported by the British state.